Hi everybody, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about the clarity of values and integrity. I think that values is one of the topics that very commonly causes confusion and cynicism and misunderstanding because it sort of sounds like a vague and abstract term, but in fact, I want to begin with the definition, with a very clear definition of values. So, what are values? Values are the ways of being and living that we hold really important in our hearts. So, the thing why we are so skeptical and cynical very often when we hear talks about values is because there is a gap between professing values and then practicing values. The gap between claiming that something is important to you and actually acting on that claim. And also, since there is a gap, and we can observe it very commonly in the culture, then the question becomes, why do people profess values in the first place? So what is their motivation to profess values, to say that something is important to them? In certain situations, it can be absolutely genuine. So people just are very much aware about some principles, some guiding elements of their life philosophy, about some crucial priorities in their lives, and they just communicate that to others. So because they want others to be aware of that too, and that is absolutely genuine, and that is absolutely okay, because when those people actually have those guiding principles and those priority systems within themselves, it can be also seen in their behavior. But in other situations, people profess values with a, different motivation, and it can be intentional or unintentional, but it doesn't matter because a different motivation can be people profess values in order to impress, or in order, to be just like everybody else because everybody else professes those values, or people do this for publicity, especially on social media. You can see just there's thousands of people who profess values like honesty and authenticity and social justice and empathy. And one of the values that is particularly common these days that people profess is vulnerability. Like, vulnerability is the new black. So this word is just thrown around everywhere, and it looks like every person on social media talks about it. But in fact, very few people understand what it actually means, and even fewer people actually practice vulnerability. And I think that in this regard, Brene Brown is remarkable because she is one of the most prominent vulnerability researchers, but she's also a great role model for all of us about what it means to practice the values that a person claims. So, you can see vulnerability not just in Brene's books, but you can see it in her activism, you can see it in her work, and in the way that she interacts with other people on her page. Like, even there, you can see that she absolutely practices all the values that she professes in her research and in her public speaking. And by the way, in Brene's work, the definition of integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, and easy, and also just practicing the values rather than just professing them. And Brene herself is such a great role model for all of us in this regard. And the thing is that unfortunately, with years, I have come to this very sad but very necessary realization that integrity in our culture is rare and precious. Like, it is very uncommon to see people who actually practice what they preach, or who at least make the effort to align what they practice with what they preach. And I have come across a very painful evidence of that in my artistic journey. And so, I'm going to tell you a bit of my personal story here. So for those of you who don't know, I have a book. And this is not a research book, this is a novel. And It is a work of fiction, but at the same time, it has very strong message when it comes to politics and social justice. And it addresses a few very tough and very controversial social issues. Basically, they are corruption, mental health stigma, homophobia, medical malpractice, immigration. So, those are social issues that are globally relevant and that create a lot of measurable and observable harm nowadays. And my work addresses these problems in innovative ways, and basically, this is what defines the social relevance of this work, aside from its artistic value. And here's the thing, when I started writing that book, I already at that moment realized that it was really too big and too complex of a work in order for me to get it off the ground on my own. Because, as many of you also know, I live in Russia, and in this country, writing a book about corruption and homophobia, those things that our government works very hard to conceal, it comes with such a degree of risk, even in terms of my physical safety, that it was very hard and very scary for me to even embark on this project. Following this creative call inside of my heart and this creative idea that paid a visit to my heart and my mind. Basically, I was nowhere near sure that I would be able to finish this book because, I thought that my English wasn't good enough, that, I thought that I had no prior experience in creative writing, I didn't have a degree in social science or political science. So basically, this was in my mind saying, who do I think I am? There was a lot of this imposter shame that so many creatives are familiar with and are struggling with, even, the most successful creatives in this world. And never mind the fact that it was going to be a novel where I would have to portray the kind of relationship that I had never personally experienced, So it was a complete imposter syndrome. But nevertheless, I accepted this challenge because I had, since the time I remember myself, deep down in my heart, I had always known that creativity is my true purpose and my true calling. And as someone, but there was a lot of trauma that surrounded this and that basically blocked this dream from becoming a reality in my life. But the thing that I as a creative have always realized is that creative ideas, they have a divine origin, they're sacred. I love the way that Elizabeth Gilbert described this in her last book, Big Magic. So she says that creative ideas, they have their own consciousness, and so they know who they want to be with. So they sort of know through which person they want to be born into life. And so when this idea just pays this honor to you, that it comes to your mind and it asks you to collaborate, then you have to, pay respect back to it, and you have to respect it. So, I respected this idea, and I basically started writing this book not because I believed in my own greatness, but because I believed in the greatness of this idea, and I just saw the kind of difference that it could make for so many people out there who needed and deserved a difference to be made for them. But when 1.5 years ago I finished this book, the hard truth that I realized is that I couldn't launch it into production myself. It wasn't the kind of book that was suitable for self-publishing, and, I didn't have any connections, I didn't have any resources. I was, a poor person living in a third world country, so there was just this great creative idea that was born into life through me, through my mind, through my heart, through my hands. But in order to put it on the platform that it could really serve the world, where it could actually make the difference for those people who it was destined to benefit, where it could get enough exposure. In other words, in order to effectively get this work out there, I needed help of other people. And so when I finished it, I started basically networking. It was 4.5 years ago, and I did that networking only on Instagram because I didn't have any personal connections to start with. And then how did this networking go? Which people did I look for in this quest? So I basically looked for people working in creative industry in the US or Europe who had the kind of power or connections or influence necessary to help me with this project. But at the same time, and this is even more important, I sought out people who shared my values and the values that the mission of my book served. So basically those were intersectional social justice and empathy. Those were two core values of my work. And so I sought out for people who claimed to share those values with me through what they posted, through the image that they created on social media. And this was the basis for my networking. Like, I didn't just reach out and tell about my story or ask help from random people or only from people who had the power, but the more important thing was about those people sharing my values. And here's the result. I have, like, over these 4.5 years, I have interacted with tons of people, from different corners of the creative industry. So they ranged from talent agents to, writers, to spiritual columnists, to journalists, to fashion stylists, to filmmakers, to bloggers, to even A-list celebrities. I don't think that it makes any sense to tell who it was, but there were such folks in my networking efforts too. But the relationships and conversations with those people, they took time to build, because I didn't want counterfeit connection. I didn't want to only connect with people in order to get something from them, but I wanted to connect with people in a meaningful way, in a way where I could really make sure that they are like-hearted and like-minded, and that they share my commitment to make this world a better, fairer, more equal, and more prosperous place. And here's the result, that every time when the conversation got real, every time when it got private and off camera, and when it came to the point where those people were basically required to practice the values that they professed, it turned out that those people who professed those very values, like empathy and social justice and honesty and spirituality, they were not in the least interested in practicing those values. They very carefully avoided practicing the values that they made publicity and money from professing. And this was such a huge blow to me, because when I see it once or twice, you can think, come on, those are just issues of that particular person. But when you see it over and over again, you start to think and contextualize, and what you understand is that it's a cultural phenomenon. It's something that we have in the culture. It's not an issue of individual people. And the first story that I made from those experiences was that something was wrong with me. That for example, I had the thought that I couldn't effectively communicate my message, that my English wasn't good enough, or that my work was irrelevant, that it had no value. And then, then another story was about blaming those people, about, the story that said that they're assholes and hypocrites. But then, with time, I just zoomed out and I saw the panoramic view, which was that the lack of integrity is a common cultural problem. And it's basically the same thing that you come across in everyday situations with people close to you, like your friends or your colleagues. When you see those people profess or claim something that's important, and then not practice that, and then not act on that value statement. And this gap between the values we profess and the values we practice, it can be very huge, but it's especially blatant when we see it in people who have big power, like politicians and celebrities, people with big resources and big connections. It's especially visible and especially flagrant, because these people, their lack of integrity, it creates most harm. And the amount of that harm is directly proportional to the amount of power that they have. So their lack of integrity is especially dangerous. And one of the things that I have seen over the years is that when people avoid to practice their values, they make up excuses. They rationalize opting out of their integrity. People rationalize choosing comfort over courage, choosing what's fun over what's right, and choosing to stay away from practicing the values they professed. And in large part, this is a function of privilege. And I mentioned in one of my videos about privilege that rationalization is basically the third function of privilege. It's common and very well known. But when it comes to excuses, like different kinds of excuses that people make up, one of the top excuses that I have seen, like the excuses to opt out of integrity, is being too busy and not having the time to practice the values that they professed. I cannot tell you how many times I have come across this most stupid and ridiculous excuse. But make no mistake, this happens only when the conversation gets real. Like you cannot hear it from people on the second day of knowing them. You need to build a relationship with them to the point where there is some trust necessary to have a real conversation and be vulnerable. Or where there comes a situation that requires them to actually practice those values. But when they are required to practice those values, then instead of doing it, they opt out of that practice and they make up excuses. And the specific versions of this excuse, like I don't have the time, were so pathetic and so ridiculous. Like, I don't have the time to do it, I go to gym on this weekend, or I'm going to this party, or I'm going to this birthday, or let's have a conversation about this next month, I'm going to a vacation to some luxury resort in the Caribbean, or I don't have the time to read your emails, or I don't have the time to talk to you on FaceTime. Well, these were all sorts of these stupid chicken shit excuses that people made up to avoid real conversation and real practice of their values. And when I think about it, I remember one of my favorite life coaches and writers, Marie Forleo. So she's amazing, and she has this award-winning web television show called Marie TV. I will put a link here, so please go and check out her work. Marie is amazing. One of the most important lessons that I have learned from her work is, she says that when something is important to you, you make the time. And when it's not important to you, then you make excuses. And that's it. Amen, Marie. There's so much wisdom in that, because if you don't have the time to practice your values, then those values are just not real. Then you're only it means that you're only professing them for publicity, or impressing someone, or or fitting in, or being on the trend, or jumping on the bandwagon, or appearing better than you actually are. But those are not things that are actually important to your heart. And the hard thing is that you may profess whatever values make you comfortable at the moment, but the values that you practice are measurable and observable. Your integrity is measurable and observable, and you need to remember that. And the tricky thing here is that when it comes to public people, like people with big power, big positions, big possessions, big connections, then it takes seeing them off camera to observe their integrity. It takes having some kind of personal relationship with them. It takes having real conversations with them in private, because you can't see that, in a public space. You can't have real conversations in a space where everyone can see what they're doing, because they don't profess these values to then get caught not practicing them. So you can see their true colors only off camera, when they think that no one else will ever learn what they're doing or what they're choosing, when they think that they can shirk responsibility for acting outside the values that they profess. So, and when they think that even if you tell anybody about what they choose or what they do, then no one will believe you, and their money and their status and their influence will give them the license to make you shut up. So this is why those are the only situations where you can see their true colors, and it's not available to everybody. And I think that it also takes being vulnerable with people to see if they practice their values. And I mean really being vulnerable. I mean not using vulnerability as a tool to probe into people, on the second day of knowing them, but being vulnerable in a real way. For example, telling them your story over time, or asking for help at some point, or getting in a situation with them where you need empathy. Like, it takes this kind of vulnerability for you to let people show their true colors. And basically, that's the only guarantee that you get with vulnerability, because vulnerability is something that comes with no guarantees. It's all about uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure. But that's the only guarantee that when you're being vulnerable, then really vulnerable, genuinely vulnerable, then whether people like it or not, their true colors come out. And you can see those. And unless you are vulnerable, you cannot see their true colors. Unless you're vulnerable, you cannot let people act in alignment with who they really are, as opposed to who they want to pretend. And I think that the hard but constructive lesson from this is this. When you see that people carefully avoid practicing the values that they passionately profess, or yet worse, make money from professing, then it's game over. Like, unfortunately, it's game over, because when there's no integrity on the part of another person, there can be no trust. And when there's no trust, you cannot be vulnerable with them, and you also cannot have a meaningful, real, successful relationship with them, because a real and successful relationship is not possible in the absence of trust, and trust is not possible in the absence of integrity. Like, integrity is one of the 7 elements that inform trust, and Brené Brown has a great analysis of that in her work. So when you see this persistent lack of integrity, then the only right thing to do is to walk away from those people and basically look for new people. And I know that looking for new people and building new relationships can be very hard. It can be increasingly hard when you come across failures of integrity over and over again. And you can feel so desperate that you can just make up a story that something is wrong with you, or the story that no one in this world has integrity, or the story that everybody who has power and privilege, by definition, has no integrity. But those are just stories, like, those are bullshit, basically, because in fact, you don't know the true colors of another person unless there comes a situation where you can see them. And so, in fact, it just takes being open, curious, authentic, generous, vulnerable, and non-judgmental. It takes not judging new people based on your past experiences, and instead walking into new relationships with the presumption of generosity, which is the presumption that people are telling the truth and that they actually practice the values that they profess. And then it takes giving them a chance to practice those values and then seeing what they actually do. So I do hope you take this message on a positive note. As always, I would love to have a conversation with y'all, so please do leave me a comment below. And if you find this video helpful and insightful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and I will catch you next time on Jorge Ora's YouTube channel. Take care, be brave, show up, and bye.